It's Dynasty season, and today we're talking quarterbacks. I'll be taking you through my full Dynasty rankings, discussing who you should draft in startups, who you should trade in existing leagues, and how you should value these players compared to other positions. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. And you can also follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down and on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Today we're talking about quarterbacks, and I'm talking about Dynasty. I'm taking you through my rankings. It's a bit hard to rank quarterbacks in Dynasty. In fact, it's a bit hard to rank in general because everyone's in a different life cycle with their Dynasty leagues. If you're doing a startup, your life cycle is going to be dictated by those first few picks. If you've got an existing team, you need to think about whether you're trying to win now or whether you're trying to rebuild. If you're somewhere in between, then these rankings will be about right. But you really do want to be deciding whether you're trying to win at the moment, whether your window's in a year or two, or whether you're going to do a full rebuild. I will talk about a couple of players who fit specifically into certain regions and will have more value depending on what's going on. For example, I was lucky enough last night to do a startup mock draft with the guys from CBS Sports. And I took Caleb Williams' first pick and then ended up with Jaden Daniels' second pick. Unsurprisingly, for the rest of the draft, I was picking mostly young plays because it fit in with what I was trying to do. Make sure you take that into consideration while you're drafting so you don't end up with some old guys and some guys that aren't going to be able to help you immediately. For me, though, no matter what's going on, the number one pick in Dynasty, at least among quarterbacks, is Josh Allen for me. You can see that consistency there. Top two player within the last 4 seasons. For a guy who runs as much as he does, he's done a really good job of staying healthy. He throws the ball pretty accurately, and even though he doesn't have the best receiving core, he's still made it work. They now bring in Kean Coleman. We already have Dalton Kincaid there. They've brought in Curtis Samuel. I think that's enough weapons for him. Stephon Diggs wasn't doing much last year, and he still managed to finish first overall. His legs give him a really good base to work from. So you're talking about a guy who's going to produce all the time. Now, in a Superflex league, he's probably the best player around. He's my number one pick overall. But if you're talking about a non-Superflex league where you're only starting one QB, it's really hard to value him. It really depends on how much cycling you want among your players and how deep the rosters are. If you're talking about pretty shallow rosters, most of the time you can pick up quarterbacks pretty easily. But if you're talking in a deeper team where most of the quarterbacks are taken, you still should be taking Josh Allen pretty early within the first couple of rounds. Now, there are a couple of other guys who, for me, are pretty close to Allen. Patrick Mahomes falls right behind. They're both about 28 years old, so they've got a long time to go. We know how old quarterbacks can play these days, and you'd expect these guys have the weapons to be able to play for at least another 6-7 years, if not more. You'd hope more. Pat Mahomes, though, has been a little bit less consistent. He's still making it work. Obviously, they've won the Super Bowl the last 2 years, but not as much consistency in his fantasy output, and he's still playing most of the games. You'd hope for a little bit better, but you're talking about someone who's still going to give you good, high-quality output most games. Travis Kelce's going to be around for a couple of years because he's just re-signed. They've just brought in Xavier Worthy, and obviously there's Rashee Rice with a couple of issues there around his suspension possibly, but there's going to be enough receiving weapons there to make it work. We're not talking about the Tyreek Hill years anymore, unfortunately, but we're still talking about a guy who can be a consistent fantasy weapon for you. For that reason, for me, he goes number 2 because I think in 5-10 seasons' time, he's still going to be able to produce. A lot of his production comes with his arms, and because he's not relying on his legs as much, he's not going to fade as much as he gets older. That's the main reason for my concern among Jalen Hurts. Admittedly, he is a little bit younger, but we're talking about a guy who does a lot of work with his legs. Most of his fantasy success comes because he runs the ball so well. The fact that he won't be able to do that as he gets older means that he will probably fade in production. We do see that with rushing quarterbacks. They start off really well, and then as they get older, they're not able to produce to the same level. So while I do think you're going to get quite a few good years out of him, probably another 3, 4, 5 years where he's still able to run the ball a fair bit. At some point, he's going to have to change his game and become a more pass-heavy quarterback. I just don't think he's going to have as much success doing that as a lot of the other guys around him do. Mahomes, we know most of the work he does with his arm. Josh Allen's got a good enough arm to be able to sustain that, even without him running. I'm not sure that's true with Jalen Hurts. So we're talking about a guy who's going to help you a lot in the short term. And if you're in a situation where you're winning now, he's probably the number one quarterback to have. It wouldn't surprise me in redraft if he's the first quarterback off the board. But if you're thinking dynasty and you're thinking a little bit long term, you do need to think, am I trying to win now or am I rebuilding? And if you're in a rebuild, Jalen Hurts is a great guy for you to trade away because his fantasy value is likely to move slowly downwards over time. Another guy whose value is a bit all over the place at the moment is Joe Burrow. And I don't feel very confident having him in the 4th spot here. It's just really awkward putting him above the other guys. He didn't look great last year, but they bring in Jermaine Burton, who I think will be a good replacement for Tyler Boyd. They've kind of at least got Eric All there as another receiving option. So he's got enough weapons around him. Jamar Chase is going to be there, hopefully for the long term. And at least T. Higgins comes back for another year. But it's just hard to know what to expect from Burrow, who wasn't particularly good when he was healthy last year. Plus, he only played 10 games. But he was a top 5 quarterback before that. So you have to feel like the quality is always going to be there because he is such a good NFL player. And he really doesn't rely on his legs at all for fantasy production. And that brings a lot of upside in Dynasty because you know he's going to keep producing long term. You're going to get another, 8 to 10 years out of him where you'd have to feel like he's going to be able to play at least with a similar style because of the style of quarterback he is. Now, for me, there's a little bit of risk taking him here. There's a big gap between those top 3 and Burrow for me. And then these next probably 4 guys are all pretty close. So it really depends on what you're feeling and what you need for your team. But Burrow's a guy, especially in 6-point touchdown leagues, that you should be taking relatively high in drafts. Lamar Jackson, same age, total opposite player. We're talking about a guy who really is going to need to change his game if he's going to have success in the NFL long term. He's getting to the point where his legs are starting to become a little bit of a liability because it's causing him to get injuries. We saw them kind of think about changing that in 2022, and it did hurt him a little bit. And then he started to run a lot more last year again. And ultimately, that's just not a recipe for long-term success. So I do like him in the short term. For this year and for the next couple of years, he's almost certainly going to be a top 5 quarterback because his legs are so good. But that's not going to last forever. As he gets into his 30s, he's going to need to learn to throw the ball better. And at the moment, there just haven't been signs to suggest he's going to be able to do that. So he's a guy you should definitely be looking at if you're in a dynasty startup where you're trying to win immediately, or you're in a situation where you're trading for quarterbacks and you want a guy who can help you straight away. You can probably prize him away from somebody by trying to push that narrative. Having said that, if the person who owns him is just attached to the current production, it's going to be a lot tougher. It's going to be a lot easier to sell him at high value right now if you would decide you're going to go through a rebuild. Now, the other total opposite end of this is Caleb Williams, who obviously comes in 22 years old, number 1 pick, one of the best prospects we've seen in a long time. The only reason he's this low, honestly, is because there is risk. We haven't seen him play in the NFL. I think he definitely has potential to be a top 4 quarterback. And in many situations, I would take him in the top 4. If I was going full rebuild, I would prefer him over Lamar Jackson, and I'd prefer him over Joe Burrow. And I wouldn't argue with anyone taking him 4th overall. Heck, I think there's some argument to suggest that if you're going to do a long-term rebuild, or if you're thinking very long-term, it would make sense to put him ahead of Jalen Hurts as well. We're talking about a guy who can run the ball enough to offer production there, but he's got a massive amount of weapons at the moment. The Bears have done a fantastic job of putting him in a position to succeed. They brought in Rome Odunze, they brought in Keenan Allen, they already had DJ Moore, they've got Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett, and they've got really good receiving back in DeAndre Swift as well. There's so many weapons available that even though the Bears might not necessarily be winning this year, they're certainly going to be heading in that direction. So I love the idea of taking Caleb Williams. He's someone that in a super flex league, I'm taking as high as I possibly can. Having said that, you're probably going to find that he falls a little bit, especially in startups, because people are going to be attached to the known names. And there is this, this idea around that Caleb Williams is going to be a bust. I could not disagree more. I don't think there's any basis for that. I think he's shown all the indications of success. I know he's a little bit arrogant. I know he's got some personality things that some people don't jive with, and that's fine. But in the NFL, he's going to be a good player. And realistically, that's all we care about for Dynasty. Now, another guy who really boomed last year, who really popped off, was CJ Stroud. We're talking about a guy who finished 13th in fantasy, but he looked really good. And we know that quarterbacks do tend to struggle in their first year. So the fact that he nearly finished as a QB1 in his first year is a really good sign. Again, we're talking about a guy who doesn't really run the ball too much, and that's good for Dynasty long term. But it does kind of limit his upside a little bit. They have put a lot of weapons around him, bringing Stephon Diggs in, for example, because they continually were having injuries and having to rely on Noah Brown and Robert Woods last year. I think that's a smart move. They brought back Dalton Schultz as well. So they've definitely got the weapons in place for him. Whether he can succeed, well, it's going to be more of a question of whether he succeeds in fantasy. I think we're talking about a guy who's going to be a good NFL quarterback long term. But the real question is he going to be a good fantasy quarterback for the long term? I don't really see him as being a guy who can consistently finish in the top 5. I see him more in the direction of a Tom Brady, where we're talking about a guy who has more NFL success than fantasy success. Tom Brady, for a lot of his seasons, wasn't right up the top unless he was throwing a lot of touchdowns. In a 6-point touchdown league, CJ Stroud, of course, increases in value. But in a four-point touchdown league, when their defense is going to start improving, he's not going to need to attack as much, and he's not going to score as many points or at least throw for as many yards. He's not going to run for yards. So you're talking about a guy who's going to need to get touchdowns to produce. And I'm just not convinced that that's going to work in a 4-point touchdown league compared to a lot of the other guys around him. So he belongs in the 7 spot to me, even though I think there is a reasonable argument in certain situations to take him a lot earlier. Anthony Richardson is a guy that comes with a lot of risk, but we saw how good he could be last year. He was the one I really wasn't sure about, did not play a lot of college games, only played a dozen or so games in college, and didn't really look fantastic. Obviously, we know his legs are amazing. He can really run the ball to an elite extent, but is he going to be able to produce with his arm? Well, probably not long term, but he's a guy that's only 22 years old. So you're talking about a guy who's going to be able to work as a runner for at least the next 5 or so years, and that's fantastic for fantasy. So I do love the idea of taking him after that first bunch of 7 or so guys, because I do feel like there's so much upside here. We're talking about a guy who can be one of the top couple of options, kind of fits in that Lamar Jackson mold of a guy who's going to get most of his yards on the ground. But we also saw he was able to throw last year. In the limited sample we saw from him, he was productive. The problem is he's going to get injuries with a quarterback who runs a lot. He's going to have to learn to stay healthy without losing that ability to get yards on the ground. So there's a bit of risk there, but there's so much upside that I like the idea of taking him ahead of those other guys who haven't really been able to produce consistently in fantasy from what we've seen. Another guy that falls into that exact same category is Jaden Daniels. And frankly, I like him better as a quarterback than Anthony Richardson. We've got talking about a guy who is a consistent thrower of the ball. He doesn't make a lot of mistakes, very few interceptions, but he can still throw the ball deep and accurately. If anything, he's not quite aggressive enough. And I feel like for fantasy, you want a guy who's going to be willing to kind of throw into tight windows. We don't get punished that much by interceptions compared to how much an NFL quarterback in the NFL gets punished for interceptions. So there are some reasons to believe that this is a guy that could potentially be an elite fantasy option because of his legs. He's got Lamar Jackson level running skills, but he can also throw the ball. The problem is he goes to the Washington Commanders and there's not really the weapons in place. They don't really have a clear tight end. They bring in Ben Sinnott. They've got Zach Ertz there. That's not really enough. Terry McLaurin is really their own real wide receiver option. Jahan Dotson's kind of tending into bust territory at the moment. And Luke McCaffrey is a big question mark as well. So we don't really know who he's going to throw the ball to. Realistically, he's probably a couple of years away from actually being able to be a good, productive passing option as an NFL quarterback. But in fantasy, if he's going to run for 800, 1,000 yards, he's going to finish somewhere in the top 5 to 10 quarterbacks. And that makes this outstanding value here as a guy that you probably don't even need to take at 9, because I think there are a couple of quarterbacks will probably go off the board before him. I love Jaden Daniels. I'd consider taking him ahead of Anthony Richardson in certain situations as well. I think there's so much upside here as a guy who's such a good runner. Now, Dak Prescott is someone that is being punished for his age. Realistically, 30 years old, he's going to have a good 5 years, 6, 7 years less than a lot of the guys you're taking ahead of him. But we're starting to see him produce more consistently. When he's been healthy, he's been a top 10 quarterback lately. And that wasn't always the case earlier in his career. After he really boomed in his rookie year, he started to fall back a little bit, but he started to produce a lot more consistently. Obviously, he's missed some games in the past, and that's a bit of an issue, but I'm not really sure that we can say he's an injury-prone player. I think he was just a little bit unlucky. So I feel like we're going to see consistent production from him. Obviously, they've got enough weapons. It'll be nice if they brought in another receiver. I don't think Brandon Cooks is a great number 2 receiver at this stage in his career, now that he's into his 30s. We also don't really have a clear number 3 receiver. It's called Jalen Tolbert. Is it? They're going to use Turpin a little bit as kind of a scat back kind of guy who's just going to do some like end arounds and stuff like that. So they don't really have a clear option. I don't really believe in most of the rookies they brought in as receivers, either as the undrafted free agents or anything else. So I'm not really sure what's going to happen there, but realistically, we know that he can produce with CeeDee Lamb and with Jake Ferguson. Whether the running backs can do it, well, we don't know. They've always been able to lean on a good running game. I'm not sure that's going to be the case. Bringing Zeke back's not exactly bringing a lot of confidence. Maybe Dowdle's the guy, but I don't know. They need to sort that O-line out. They need to make some changes. But in Dynasty, we're talking about a guy who we know can produce for fantasy and do it consistently. So even though he's 30, you're still going to get a good 5, 6, 7 years out of him because of the way he plays. Hopefully he doesn't lose too much by not being able to rush as much as he gets older. Now, Kyler Murray is a guy with a lot of risk. We're talking about a guy who was the top quarterback in fantasy a few years ago, and he just hasn't been able to stay healthy since then. He's been pretty good when he's been on the field, but we saw last year, at the end of last year, it really wasn't quite there. There wasn't quite the production that he needed to have. I'm not sure that we can really rely on him being a good quarterback long term. I don't even know that he's going to stay with the Cardinals. He'll stay as the starting quarterback in the NFL. I hope that he does. I believe he has the talent, but we haven't actually seen it happen for a long time. We haven't seen him stay healthy and produce. So I'm hoping that that's something we see, but because there's so much risk and because he might need to stop running in order to be able to stay healthy, that means that there is a lot more risk with Murray than there is with a lot of the quarterbacks in this region. So we're talking about a guy who could be a top option or he could be a total bust. So you need to take that into account. If you're just trying to win now, then it does kind of make sense to pick him up because you know that if he booms, he is going to win for you. He's going to produce. But there's so much risk that if I'm going through a rebuild, I'm probably better off just selling him or at least waiting until he has a couple of good games to start this year and then selling him. The fact that he's got Marvin Harris now is something that's got to help him. And I do like that opportunity for him to at least start the season positively. But there are going to be a lot of calls for the Cardinals to move on to someone else if they can't win this year, if he can't produce, and if he can't stay healthy. So it's kind of a space to watch. He's still pretty young, so there's still plenty of long-term upside there. There's just a significant downside compared to a lot of the other guys in this region. Trevor Lawrence is another guy with a lot of downside. We haven't actually really seen him produce consistently. He had amazing receiving calls last year. He's got good receiving running backs. He had Calvin Ridley coming in and producing pretty well. Christian Kirk was very good when he was healthy. Zay Jones is underrated for me. I'm really disappointed they let him go. They now bring in Brian Thomas, who we know is a very good player as a rookie. And Gabe Davis as well is someone that can at least give him that deep threat as well. So the weapons are there. Evan Ingram comes back as well. So we're talking about a guy who should be good for fantasy, but he just hasn't been able to produce consistently, and that really worries me. I'm not willing to take him as high as some of those other guys because he hasn't proven to be a reliable option. He should be. On paper, he should have been fantastic last year, and yet it didn't turn out that way. And that gives me a lot of pause and a lot of concern. So for that reason, he drops down to 12 for me. He's someone I think you can take a shot on. I think there's certainly upside there. I think he's also someone who's going to be useful in the long term. So if you're rebuilding, he's someone you might be able to get cheaply from someone who's trying to just win now. But it's going to be hard to prize that big name former number 1 pick away from somebody unless he has a truly terrible season and really struggles. At the moment, he's kind of been okay. And for that reason, people still have that hope that things will get better. But if someone's willing to sell him cheap, he's someone I'd at least take a shot on. Jordan Love is someone who boomed last year, but it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen long term. Obviously, he has a lot of good young receivers, not only their 3 starters, but we saw Dontavian Wicks go well. Even Bo Melton looks good. This offense just seems to be working in a way that's really helping the pass game. The run game was pretty strong, and I'm a little bit concerned that Aaron Jones is out the door. Josh Jacobs might be able to take that over, but that kind of allowed them to pass the ball really well. They've got a lot of good pass-catching options, and that should really help. And I'm really hoping that Luke Musgrave emerges a lot more and stays healthier this year because I really like him as well. I don't know that Jordan Love looked fantastic as an NFL quarterback. I think just the system was really working for him. And that's something that's fine. Look, if he's going to succeed because of a good system, that's great as long as he's planning on staying in Green Bay long term. And I think that's probably the plan for all the sides involved. If he can produce again this year, he's going to jump up in my rankings a lot. But 1 year is just not enough for me. We've seen Daniel Jones finish in the top 6 quarterbacks in fantasy before as well. And admittedly, didn't look quite as good as Jordan Love did. But there are plenty of guys who've had one good season and then dropped down. Geno Smith last year was another good example as well. So don't put all your eggs in this basket yet. It's good that he had a good season, but realistically, people are probably going to be buying a little bit high on him, especially when they recognize just how good he looked for fantasy last season compared to a lot of the other guys who either got injured or had some struggles, for example. So I think that 5th is a little bit inflated. It does tend to be for fantasy. The guys in the 5th, 6th, 7th region aren't always the best quarterbacks. They're just guys that stayed healthy and just happen to have a good boom season. So be a little bit wary with Love, but he is a guy that has some upside. Tua Tagovailoa, another guy who I was hoping for a little bit more from him last year, but at least he finished in the top 10 in fantasy. And most importantly, he stayed healthy. He hasn't been able to stay healthy much in his career. And the fact that he was at least out on the field there most of the time is really useful for fantasy and just good for him because I'm a big fan of his. Now, is he going to be able to keep producing for fantasy? Well, the Dolphins are putting the weapons in place for him. They've got Tyreek Hill coming back at least for another season or two, hopefully longer. Jalen Waddle's, of course, there as well. And then they brought in Odell Beckham Jr. They needed that third receiver, and they're bringing a guy who's not quite as quick, but still okay, but brings a little bit of size. Obviously, they also brought in the 2 Washingtons, the young 7th rounders they brought in, who have a lot of speed. I'm hoping that one of them produces. Probably Malik is the one that went earlier, and I think is probably the better player. So I'm hoping they can get something out of those guys. Tight end-wise, they're struggling a little bit, but Jonnu Smith's at least a better option than the alternative, which is probably Durham Smythe. So they've at least got some options in place. Their run game's going to be elite. We know that, and because it's so good, it kind of makes it hard for Tua to produce consistently. He's going to have those games where the Dolphins win easily enough and he hardly scores at all because they are able to run the ball all game. So he's not going to have those same big boom games against bad defenses because they're going to be able to run on those bad defenses. That makes him a little bit iffy for fantasy. But I think the fact that he had a really good year at least gives him a little bit more job security for the next few seasons. And that's good for fantasy because we want guys in Dynasty who are going to play for the next few seasons at least. So I like the idea of taking Tua somewhere in this range. Some people will have him higher or lower based on how much they believe in his ability to get even better. I don't know that he's ever going to be a top 5 quarterback because of the offense, even though I think he has the skills. And for that reason, I can't have him any higher than this. He's also someone that I think probably is a better short-term option than long-term option because I don't know that we really know what the Dolphins are going to do long-term. A lot of the guys they've brought in are very much short-term options, slightly older guys. So it's hard to know how the system's going to work and whether other teams are going to start working it out. So he's someone I'd rather if I'm trying to win now rather than someone that I go to if I'm trying to rebuild. Justin Herbert is a guy who I'm very scared by. I know this seems insanely low for Justin Herbert. We're talking about a guy who was the quarterback 2 a couple of seasons ago. The injury last season obviously makes his rank look a little bit lower than it was. But my concern is the offense used to be pretty pass heavy, and he was able to have a lot of success in it because of that. But now it goes to that half-hour system, and I think they're going to run the ball a lot, and I think they're going to keep it pretty safe and kind of start to try to long-term try to lean on their defense a little bit. I don't think Justin Herbert's actually quite as good as we kind of think of him as being. He throws a lot of interceptions, makes a surprising amount of errors. I think he's probably not running the ball enough to really produce at a high level either, even though he can do that a little bit. We're talking about a guy, he's now 26. He's not young anymore. He should be able to produce a little bit more consistently. Now, the Chargers admittedly do need to put better weapons in place for him. They're at least trying to protect him a little bit better. But he doesn't really have any clear number one pass catchers this year. It's just a whole lot of guys. Josh Palmer was the number 3 last year. Now suddenly he's the number 1. I just don't think he's cut out for that. Quinton Johnston, there's a real risk he's going to turn into a bust. They brought DJ Chark in there, which is a little bit wacky as well. So Lad McConkey, obviously, they just drafted. So there's a whole heap of guys who are kind of solid number 2 or 3 receivers. One of them is going to have to turn into that top option because they don't have a tight end at the moment as well. It's kind of Will Disley is on there, and he'll probably get a lot of snaps. Hayden Hurst, maybe. It's very difficult to see who's going to be doing most of the receiving work in LA. So for that reason, I'm pretty nervous about how they're going to go this year, and probably for the next couple of years, they start to build into what Harbaugh's trying to do here. I don't know that he really fits that idea of playing, system quarterback, but they might need to do that simply so he stops turning the ball over. For that reason, for fantasy and dynasty in general, I think this is probably a sell high opportunity on Justin Herbert. I think that he's probably not going to get much better in the next couple of years. I hope I'm wrong. I do have a surprising amount of Justin Herbert shares, but I'm feeling a little bit nervous, and I'll be selling off as many of those as I can. Brock Purdy's another guy who's kind of worked really well in the system. I talked about Jordan Love. Obviously finished 5th. Brock Purdy finishes 6th. That same spot of that Daniel Jones and Geno Smith for the year before, finishing as the 5th or 6th quarterback because you had a good year, you stayed healthy, and your team was forced to throw the ball a little bit more than expected. Other teams hadn't quite worked you out yet. I don't think that Brock Purdy is actually that particularly talented. I think he's just kind of making it work in a system that is really effective with excellent players around him. We're talking about the best running back in football. We're talking about 2 really good wide receivers in Debo and Ayuk. And we're talking about one of the best tight ends, and especially one of the best blocking tight ends in George Kittle as well. So there's so many good weapons there. We know how good that San Fran offense can be. And their defense is good enough to put pressure on and allow the offense to thrive as well. So there's a lot of things to like about the offense, but I don't think Purdy's one of them. I think he's just kind of making it work. For that reason, I don't really particularly want him in fantasy because even though he's in a good team where he'll probably produce okay while he's there, I don't think we can rely on him consistently being the quarterback. If he can't win a Super Bowl in the next couple of seasons, it wouldn't surprise me if they look elsewhere and think, well, maybe we need a guy who can get the job done. I don't necessarily believe that Purdy was the reason they didn't win the Super Bowl this year. I just think that they could have brought in other players who have a little bit more talent. And as soon as Purdy's rookie contract runs out, I can't imagine the team is going to be willing to pay him a lot of money, given they've needed to pay so many other players to succeed. And that's got to come at the expense of the rookie contract of the quarterback. So I think that'll be really interesting to see what happens. I think there's a lot more risk here than with a lot of the other guys around this range. Now, Drake May is another guy that comes with a lot of risk, but in his case, there's a massive amount of upside. The problem is, firstly, probably not going to play to start the year. I think they probably start off with Jacoby Brissett. And secondly, even when he plays in this first year, the Patriots are going to be awful this year. They've got no weapons. They just don't have the ability to move the ball on offense. They brought in Jalen Polk, who's a good player. In a good receiver class, he's a good receiver, but I don't know that that's going to be enough to get him across the line. Kendrick Bourne's going to have some big games, but who are the guys that are actually going to put up 1,000+ yards? I don't think they have that guy yet. I don't think the rest of the offense is good enough to make it kind of hum. Ramondre Stevenson was a bit disappointing. The O-line needs to get better. The defense will keep doing the job, but at the moment they're just really going to try to grind out games. I expect with a defensive-minded head coach, you don't really want the quarterback there in most situations, and that makes me a little bit nervous about Nat May. Not because of the talent, because I think there's a massive amount of upside here, but I do think he's going to take a couple of years to develop. Having said that, he's pretty cheap in most dynasty leagues. So if you're doing a startup and you're skewing even a little bit young, or you're thinking a couple of years down the track because you've got a couple of veterans and you need someone that can kind of come in and just sit for a little bit, I do think that in 2 or 3 years, May's going to be pretty good. So if you can get him cheap, he's someone you can get in. Plus, even if you can't, later on in the season when he's struggling and nothing much is happening, you'll probably have a good chance to buy him as people start to think further down the road and start to wonder whether this guy's going to be a bust. So if you're going to draft him, you're going to need to keep the faith because it is going to take a little bit of time before he booms. He does have that upside of a guy with a big arm. He can run sufficiently well. So there's all those pieces there that should be good for fantasy. It's just whether he can put it together, and that's not going to happen straight away. Now, Jared Goff's a guy who's had a couple of surprisingly good seasons, but he's another guy. I don't know that it's really him. I think the offense is just very good. I think it's very well run. Their running game is excellent. And they can often just throw once they get to the red zone. Sam Laporta was spectacular last year, which is really good. Amon-Ra St. Brown was really good. Jameson Williams is a guy I expect emerges a little bit this year. So I'm not sure that Goff's really the reason. I think he's a guy who is, again, just staying healthy for the whole season and producing okay with a lot of touchdowns. In a 6 touchdown league, he'd move up a little bit higher for me, but I don't really know in what situation you'd really want Jared Goff. In a 1 QB league, you do not want him starting for you unless it's a very big league with 20 to 32 teams. In a Superflex league, I think he's fine as your QB if you've really spent up elsewhere. He's going to produce enough that you're probably going to succeed if you can get enough production out of your other positions because you can't get those elite quarterbacks. But he's not someone I'm going out of my way to get. I'm a little bit nervous about what you're going to get out of Jared Goff long-term or even short-term in the next couple of years. So that's why he falls down to 18 for me. Deshaun Watson's another guy that has a lot of risk. It's amazing to think he's younger than Jared Goff and a lot of these other guys that we talk about, Dak Prescott and people like that. It feels like he's kind of been around for quite a long time. He was excellent in his first few seasons. Obviously, then hardly played in the last 3 years, suspensions, injuries, and everything else. He hasn't looked particularly good when he has played, but the Browns are at least smart enough to not do what the Broncos did with Russell Wilson and at least stick with him for a little bit. They're kind of still in their win now window, and for that reason, they just kind of need to make this work. We saw they can make it work with Joe Flacco. So surely Deshaun Watson can make things happen. They brought in a lot of weapons around him. I like what they've done there. I like the fact that not only they brought in Amari Cooper last year, of course, but they brought in Jerry Jeudy as well. I mean, your mileage may vary on Jeudy and whether you think he's a good player. I think he looked really good out of college and he could produce if he's put in the right system, but whether he's willing to put in the hard work is a big question mark. Obviously, they did the same thing with Elijah Moore. So they're putting in a lot of guys who've kind of busted elsewhere and they're hoping to make it work. I'm not sure they've really been shown to be able to make it work for players who failed somewhere and they're trying to retread them. It hasn't really worked out for them so far, but they do have a lot of really strong weapons. Their run game's been a real highlight for a while. Their O-line has been very good for a long time. So it's going to need to kind of get up to that elite point again in order to make Deshaun Watson a massive success. I do think there's plenty of upside here. I like the idea of taking him, especially if you're in a win now window, because he could potentially be a top 10 quarterback if it all comes together. I think there's a lot of upside there, but he could also be out of the league in a season or two. So there's definitely some risk there, but I can think of some reasons why you might want to take him. JJ McCarthy's another guy with a lot of risk. He's my third rookie off he's my fourth rookie off the board. I nearly forgot about Drake May. Obviously, he only really goes ahead of Penix because Penix might not play for the next season or two. JJ, I think he's probably going to be playing by halfway through the season. I think we probably see Sam Darnold for a while. I think we see that doesn't work particularly well. And even if it does work, I think they'll probably just find an excuse to get McCarthy out there. We're talking about a guy who they do really like. They were willing to take in the top 10 picks. I know they didn't trade up as much as people expected, but ultimately, they still did take him with a high first-round pick. That means a lot. And that means they're going to be willing to give this guy enough time to get things right. He's got a lot of weapons around him. Justin Jefferson's fantastic. Jordan Addison is someone that at least has upside. They don't really have an amazing run game they can rely on, but they brought Aaron Jones in, and we know he's a good receiving running back as well. TJ Hawkinson should be back by halfway through the season. How good he is in his first season, I don't know, but at least that's going to give McCarthy some weapons. For that reason, he's a guy I'm interested in taking as a second quarterback or as a backup quarterback. I don't think he quite has the same upside as a lot of the other guys. So if you're in a 1 QB league, I don't know why you'd really go for McCarthy. You kind of, I don't think there's that upside of being a top 5 quarterback necessarily, despite the weapons. But if you're really struggling at quarterback, I think it's someone that you could probably take on knowing that he could at least be a starter for you. Now, didn't make the graphics for the rest of the guys, but I'm going to go through these guys a little bit quicker. Once you're out of that top 20, you're really talking about super flex situations or taking pot shots on guys. Baker Mayfield is a guy who can produce okay if you're in a win now situation. I expect he's probably going to only be around for a couple of seasons. I can't imagine that's going to keep working in Tampa, especially when Mike Evans and Chris Godwin are out the door. So he's someone that can produce for a year or two, and then I think he's probably gone. For that reason, I do like him in this spot because there is some upside of him possibly having some good seasons, but I wouldn't go out of my way to get him. Bryce Young's another guy that comes with a fair bit of risk. We saw him be very disappointing in his first year, but that's normal for rookie quarterbacks. They're usually disappointing. CJ Stroud looked amazing. That made Bryce Young look pretty mediocre by comparison. But he's actually not a bad player, and we just need to see him have an opportunity to produce with some actual weapons. They brought in Deontay Johnson. They brought in Xavier Legette, who I keep banging the table about how much I like him. They've actually got some tight ends now. I like Jatavian Sanders. I think he's a good receiving weapon as well. So they've brought in some tools. They've got a good running back now, and Jonathan Brooks as well. So there's a lot of rookie weapons here for him to work with. I feel like this is a team that could be good in a season or two. This is a good opportunity to buy low, especially if you're rebuilding at the moment. Bryce Young's the kind of second-year player I think you can take on, knowing that other people are going to undervalue him and you might be able to get something out of him. Michael Penix is another guy that you only really think about if you're rebuilding. He's probably not going to be playing for the next, season or so unless Kirk Cousins either struggles or gets injured. In either of those situations happens, obviously they go to Penix, but I think more realistically, he's probably a year or two down the track for him. I think he'll probably be a pretty good quarterback once that happens, but not many dynasty players are willing to take a player even relatively high that's going to have to sit for so long. So there is a lot of risk there for that reason, but I do certainly think there's a lot of upside of a guy that they clearly really like, and he does have some talent, even though he's already 23, he's already played, and he's turning 24. I guess that's all 23-year-olds are. He's already played, 6 years in college. He's had some injury issues. So for that reason, it's hard to really rely on him, but we're talking about someone who could be a good player. Then we get to this range of a lot of the older players, Stafford, Cousins, Smith, Carr. Realistically, we're talking about guys that probably don't have more than a couple of years in them. I think Stafford probably has the most upside this year of these guys. We know that Kirk Cousins can be good as well. There's at least a lot of weapons there in Atlanta, but it's hard to rely on the idea of them leaving him in that starting role later in the season if they miss out on the playoffs. Now, to be fair, they could make the playoffs. I think that's possible. They've got the weapons if they bring Cousins in, but their defense isn't very good still. They haven't really got the weapons in there if they're a defense. So for that reason, it's hard for me to believe that Cousins is still going to be there as a reliable option later in the season. Certainly more than the season down the track. I think we'll probably find that Michael Penix is in there within like a year and a half or something like that. Because there's that much risk of that happening compared to Stafford, he goes a little bit lower than me. Stafford obviously has a lot of good weapons. Puka Nakua's broken out, so I like that upside there. Geno Smith, I think last year, 2022 was a little bit of a fluke. 2023 looked okay. He looked like a starting quarterback, but not a very good one. So I don't want to go out of my way to get him. Same thing with Derek Carr. I don't think Spencer Rattler is necessarily good enough to take over from Carr. He doesn't even make my top 40, Spencer Rattler. I think he's 41 for me. I think probably the Carr replacement comes in a season or two down the road, or they bring in somebody. I think they probably give Carr another go for another year or two. We know the Saints like to just stay in this kind of 8 and 9, 9 and 8 window. Same thing with the Steelers, kind of that idea of just kind of being on the edge of playoff contention a lot of the time. And I think Carr allows them to do that. They really do need to give him more weapons, though, because Chris Olave isn't enough. They need to bring in more than just Rashid Shaheed and A.T. Perry. And they brought Bub Means in, who's at least got a little bit of upside. He's a fifth-round guy. Juwan Johnson isn't good enough as a starting tight end. Taysom Hill is going to take a lot away from Derek Carr in fantasy as well. So there's a lot of concerns there. We've then got some other younger guys with some concerns. Will Levis, it doesn't shock me he drifted into the second round. I didn't like him going into the draft last year. I didn't think it made any sense for this idea that a team was going to take him at number 2. I think he was always likely to drift. I think it made sense to take Richardson and Stroud ahead of him. I still stand by that. I think that time has kind of shown that to be the case. Levis, though, he's still a guy who could be okay in the NFL. He's got some upside. They've at least put a lot of weapons in place. Obviously, the fact they've brought in Hopkins last year was a good idea, but the fact they've brought in Ridley now, they've also brought in Tyler Boyd. They're trying to give him receiving options, which is the right move. They want to give him the opportunity to receive, especially because they're not going to be able to rely on Derrick Henry anymore. So for that reason, I can at least see some upside there for Levis, but he comes with so much risk. I think there is a real possibility that within a year or two he's done. which is true of a lot of the other players in this region as well. But there's at least a little bit more upside than a lot of these other guys. I think there's upside that within a few years, he's at least a reliable starting quarterback. But I don't really see the situation where he's going to be a consistent top 10 quarterback. He could have some boom years because they have put some good weapons around him, but I think the chance of that happening is relatively low. The same thing happened with Daniel Jones. We've seen him have some big years, and the fact that he's a good running quarterback is good, but there's been so much smoke about the idea of the Giants wanting to replace him. I know they said they didn't, but I think they're really just kind of cost restricted into not taking a rookie quarterback at the moment. It wouldn't have made sense to take one, even though that didn't stop guys like the Broncos and the Falcons from taking one, even though they're having money issues with the cap. Jones at least has some running ability, which puts him above a lot of the other guys in this just below this region. But I mean, realistically, I think it would be a little bit of a surprise if he's still a starting quarterback in 3 or 4 years. I think it's possible, but it would be surprising. So for that reason, he's someone I'd take a shot on. If I'm rebuilding and I have the roster space, he's someone that I think has a lot of upside if he is able to turn things around. Bo Nix, on the other hand, I don't think there's a lot of upside here in general. It wouldn't surprise me if he hangs around in the NFL for a while, but he profiles a little bit more as a backup quarterback, or at least a system quarterback. Kind of what I talked about with Jordan Love and Brock Purdy, but without the same amount of talent. Certainly more talent than most quarterbacks. He's at least going to be an NFL quarterback. He was drafted in the first round. I think that was a bit early. I think he probably belonged in the second round or very, very late first. But I understand that the Broncos wanted to take him to try to get their rebuild going. I think they're probably going to be pretty terrible this year, the Broncos. I think it's going to be very hard for them to be anything better than a bottom 10 team. Wouldn't surprise me if they end up with one of the top 5 picks next year. So for that reason, I don't really want Bo Nix, but he is at least someone who is a rookie quarterback that was taken in the first round that at least gives him some implicit value. Now, down the bottom, there's some familiar names here and some interesting ones as well. So I'll talk through these ones pretty quickly, but I think we've got an interesting situation. Firstly, in Pittsburgh, I think Russell Wilson probably gets the starting job, but Justin Fields obviously has a little bit more staying power. I think Wilson's probably going to be out of the league in 2 or 3 years. So Fields, on the other hand, I think he's probably going to be a backup for the most part. He needs to wait for that opportunity to get that starting role. It's probably going to be with a team that has an injury where he's the backup. Kind of like we saw with Geno Smith, for example, where comes in, gets the second opportunity, and then can take on a starting role. I think that could happen for him. And if it does, we know that he has the run game and he is willing to throw the ball to an extent that can make him really good for fantasy. So for that reason, if he can get a starting role back, I think that's good. That's a good sign. But I think the amount of money the Steelers paying him is a sign of what the NFL thinks about him. No teams were really willing to take a chance on him and to give proper draft capital to the Bears to be able to prize him away. For that reason, I think that means that the NFL probably views Fields a little bit low. Having said that, once he becomes a free agent, if he's able to see the field a little bit, or at least show what he can do, there's upside. We're talking about a guy you're probably going to have to sit on your roster for a couple of years before you get him back as a starter, depending on what happens this year in Pittsburgh. Same thing in Vegas, talking about Gardner Minshew, a guy who's done that same thing, spending time as a backup, getting some opportunities, showing he looks okay. Goes to the Raiders to take on Aiden O'Connell. A little bit surprised they didn't get a quarterback. I think they probably would have liked to have had Michael Penix if he'd fallen to that 13 spot. But they got Brock Bowers, so I think that ultimately they won out. I like the idea of either Minshew or O'Connell at least being functional and giving this team a chance. But the upside is that they probably both suck, and that means the Raiders probably get another very high-value pick. The only problem is that guys like Devontae Adams might not hang around if the team's really suffering, even though I think they probably only need 1 or 2 years of true rebuilding before they can be a good team again. I think their defense is starting to get a little bit stronger. They've worked on the O-line after Leatherwood was a big bust. They needed to improve there, and I think they made some steps in the right direction, but they probably need another year or two. Minshew and O'Connell are guys that you just take if they're playing in the Superflex league. You need a backup, and so you take a pot shot on one of those two. I think Minshew's probably the starter, but O'Connor's younger and has a little bit more potential to possibly turn into a reliable starter, whereas I think Minshew is always going to be one of those low-value guys. Sam Darnold's another guy that, I mean, he might start for a little bit this year, but I think honestly he's going to bounce around quite a lot and mostly be a backup. For that reason, he's someone you only take in very deep leagues or quite deep super flex leagues. Same thing with Sam Howell, very much a backup at the moment, but at least there's upside. And we know with Geno Smith getting a lot older, Howell at least showed he looked okay when given the opportunities. He was ultimately a little bit disappointing, but it was with Washington. Give the guy a chance. I think possibly with Seattle, he might look a little bit better. It would not shock me at all if Sam Howell starts on ability as opposed to a Geno Smith injury at some stage in this coming year. That gives him some upside and puts him ahead of a lot of the other guys. Now, I think Jarrett Stidham technically is probably the nominal starter in the Broncos. It would not surprise me if he's the starter in week 1, although I think the Broncos probably want to get bums on seats and are probably tempted to put Bo Nix out there. Having said that, I think probably if you ask Sean Payton, honestly, who he thinks would give him the most chance of winning, probably Jarrett Stidham right now, which is a terrible indictment on that team in general and their quarterback situation. But I can't see him starting long-term. For me, he's just a backup, and he probably always will be. A solid backup, a good backup, but probably still a backup. Same thing with Jacoby Brissett. We've seen him make a career out of being a backup more lately. He's looked solid when given the opportunity. I think he probably starts week 1 for the Patriots. He might end up starting all season. It's entirely possible they want to actually get Drake May to sit and learn and build. And for that reason, Brissett at least has a little bit of upside. If you're talking about a super flex league where you're just looking for any starter, Hendon Hooker is the total opposite of that. We're talking about a guy who's actually really talented, but he came into the NFL with an injury. He's never really had an opportunity. He's already 26 years old, and he hasn't even had an opportunity to take a snap. It'd be really interesting to see how he goes in the preseason, see if he can produce. He's someone I think will deserve to at least be the number 2 in Detroit. And we know that Jared Goff's not a guy who can't be taken away from that role. The problem is Hooker's only 3 years younger than him. We're not talking about a real young guy. So there is a lot of risk there, but I at least like the upside. You notice there's one name that's not here at all, and that's Aaron Rodgers. That's because he's pretty much in his 40s. And we know that Tom Brady's shown you can play into your 40s, but there's no upside there. If you're in a 1 QB league, I can't imagine the situation where you'd really want to rely on Rodgers. I don't think you can believe he's going to be a top 15 quarterback this year. Likely. I think it's possible, but I don't think it's likely to happen. And then he's probably gone within a year or two. I don't really see what situation you'd be in where that makes sense, unless you're in a very much a win now situation in a super flex league. That's probably the only situation where I'd be really going out of my way to have Rodgers. I know he's there at 32 spot at the moment, but I don't know. He's only just above a lot of these guys here for me. And if you're in a situation where you're rebuilding, he's way below all of these guys. He's only going to be useful for a year or two, so please don't go out of your way to get him. He's not even someone I particularly want in redraft. I will be back tomorrow or at least in the next couple of days to talk about running backs. And I'll go through all the other positions in Dynasty as well. Make sure you check out our website, ffdfantasyfootball.com. We've got rookie rankings up there and redraft rankings, and I'll be putting these Dynasty rankings up there very soon as well. Also, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. Just look for the Fantasy First Down. On Twitter, we are at Fantasy First Down with no O, and on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. If you've got any questions, make sure you put them in the comments, or you can hit me up on Instagram or Twitter, and I answer all your questions there. I hope you have a fantastic weekend.